My adoration for the ever-popular and beloved JRPG series Persona started when I played the third game for the first time almost a decade ago. Being a longtime fan of the game means that I am inherently invested in the anime and manga adaptations, for better or worse. I watched the anime films as they were released, and even though they are quite harmless, I generally didn't like them that much. For the most part, they come across as a highlights reel of key story moments, but what I really love about the game simply wasn't at full capacity in this version. Although I had a bit more hope for the manga adaptation, foolish or not, I'll let you decide. The covers look great, and I thought 11 volumes might be enough to communicate why this game is special. An adaptation certainly needs to do more than simply look the part, however. Generally speaking, I would want it to be a good alternative for people that might not be interested in the original game for whatever reason. Unfortunately, I think this is the worst possible way to experience the story of Persona 3, especially for any newcomer. Admitting that is frustrating beyond belief, because I truly believe it's a good manga buried under countless problems that prevent it from being a good representation of its source material. This is how, in spite of Persona 3's strengths, the manga ruined everything. Before talking about the manga or any other adaptation at length, I feel it's necessary to discuss my reasons for why I love the game. That will set the stage for my expectations for an adaptation, and hopefully it'll give you a good idea to what I think makes Persona 3 great. Not every point I'm about to make is specifically relevant to the manga, positive or negative, but this is the lens I am looking through when experiencing an adaptation. Not to mention, this is my opportunity to talk about why I love Persona 3, so I'm gonna take it. As mentioned before, Persona 3 was my introduction into both Persona and turn-based RPGs, Pokemon and Paper Mario withstanding. As someone who had just gotten into anime, was about the same age as the characters, and genuinely wanted to get into turn-based RPGs, everything kind of aligned for me to fall in love with it. Even though it took me years to eventually complete and fully appreciate the game, one aspect of growing up during those years was learning that not everything has to be perfect to be incredible. Even if Persona 3 is currently my favorite game, it does have problems. Forcing the female social links to become romantic feels a tad misguided, fusing personas is a massive pain, and the lack of controllable party members is possibly one of the most baffling design flaws an RPG has ever made. There are a number of flaws that could reasonably prevent someone from enjoying Persona 3. Yet, I can't say any of those criticisms undermine what I love about the game, because for all of its flaws, it's a strong reminder that excellence does not equal perfection. Persona 3 is a shining example of how a video game or any piece of art can surpass its own faults, limitations, and shortcomings. Persona 3 has, by a considerable margin, my favorite cast in the series. The characters and their stories, both of the main and supporting cast, are truly what make it such an amazing game. Both social links and story-driven character development is often finely detailed and sometimes profoundly sad. Its thematic core of life and death is mostly expressed through the relationships between characters. There's a real sense of empathy to these characters' stories, as if to say the true beauty of experiencing life and the necessity of accepting death is understanding other people and their struggles. Part of why I think this is the best cast in the series comes down to the structure of character arcs and how they are brilliantly interwoven into the long-term story by way of their own influence. For context, 4 and 5's main characters are typically given a small window of time that is dedicated to exploring their own smaller story. This is usually within the time frame of a month of in-game time or less. Their character is pivotal to the main storyline at that exact moment, but once that section is over, their influence in the story becomes minimal, and the story becomes minimal to their development. As soon as that section of the game is done, their character growth is relegated to their social links, a part of the game that is not intrinsically connected to the rest of the characters or story. Essentially, after their month-long arc, they are no longer a required piece of the puzzle, and that is never set right with me. me. Even some of Persona's best characters just don't have the relevance I wish they did. They become a glorified, optional side event that the player has to choose to interact with, which is not a great way to keep a character involved in the story. By giving all the main characters social links, especially ones that are relatively early, the game is unintentionally gatekeeping them from being influenced by the story. Instead, they can only be influenced by the protagonist, or more literally, the player. Persona 3's main characters are allowed their own personal agency, independent of the protagonist and player, as opposed to the approach that 4 and 5 took. More often than not, the protagonist has minimal influence over what happens to these characters and the conclusions they reach. It's a subtle but deeply important difference that makes Persona 3's characters feel more like people that can't be swayed just because you are the player. It also heightens their importance in being a part of the team. They will make their own choices, go through their own struggles, and find their own paths. Even though the female party members do have social links, their development is not limited to it. Additionally, their social links don't become available the moment they're added to your party. It's usually after they've independently been in the story for a long while, or even met the conclusion of their character arc towards the end of the game. Yukari, Mitsuru, and Aigis are allowed to change along with the passage of time, and maybe more importantly, have their own influence on the larger story. Their social links just add on top of that, rather than being a replacement for long-term story relevance. Some players may not like that male party members do not have social links, but truthfully, they don't need it. It's for that very reason a character like Junpei ends up being one of my favorites. Junpei's relationship with the protagonist is pivotal to his character arc, but it's also directly tied to the story progression. Unlike Yosuke or Ryuji, he isn't even your best friend and has downright intense conflicts with the protagonist. His character is attached to the protagonist, but not because the player chooses to further develop his character by spending time with him. It would be a little strange if, after a tense and story-driven moment between the two, they went to grab lunch and somehow their bond got stronger. Junpei isn't the type of character that ever needed a closer, more friendly relationship with the protagonist just because they were comrades in battle. My intent is not to dismiss the merits of 4 or 5's character writing. I think there's some genuinely amazing characters in those games. However, having beaten 4 and 5 prior to 3, I was blown away by the consistency of how much more I was engaged with its characters from beginning to end. I just really like how Persona 3 interconnects its characters with the story and themes of the game. Whether it's the boys or girls, whether they have social links or not, their stories are so much bigger than going to McDonald's with you. What pulls it all together is the daily life or life sim elements of Persona 3. Repeating the cycle of going to school, hanging out with a friend, talking to everyone at the dorm, and ending the day with dungeon crawling only to do it all over again the next day became a comfort food to me. The daily routine is repetitive, but isn't life itself repetitive? The world's locations became familiar, with each place having something worth seeing. I started paying attention to the ongoing stories of the NPCs, even the nameless ones. Additionally, I love checking in on everyone at the dorm each and every day. Persona 3's depiction of living a day-to-day schedule in an urban world is nothing short of delightful. I wish I could just spend forever on Tatsumi Port Island and hang out with these characters until the end of my days. This is all to serve the game's theme of life and death, which resonated with me in a profound way, but more on that later. Persona 3 is not a perfect game, but in a way, I don't mind that. While 4 or 5 are better made games on a fundamental level, 3 is far more in tune with what I want out of the series. In spite of its handful of flaws, they hardly matter because the game offers such a rich experience by way of amazing character writing, the great setting for daily life, and compelling themes. This is to say, I don't need nor expect Persona 3 in any form to be perfect. I just want it to be true to those previously mentioned strengths. This is the lens that I look through. I expect a Persona 3 adaptation to be flawed just as the game was. Likewise, I expect it to offer an engaging story with emotionally complex characters, which are supported by a surprisingly fun duality of daily life and dramatic action. At minimum, I expect a decent handling of the focal themes and main characters. There's one simple and undeniable fact that brings any Persona adaptation to its knees. Reducing an 80-hour game into less than 10 hours of content has massive ramifications. Of course, the turn-based gameplay will inherently be absent, and that roughly cuts down the total time by about half. That still leaves a sizable amount to be cut down, however, so where does that time save come from? In all fairness, most of the Persona adaptations don't cut the main storyline down in an overtly harmful way, with Persona 4's The Animation being one of the more successful attempts to tell its story. The truth is, even if an adaptation is able to tell the overarching story well, Persona's worth is far greater than the larger story beats. Unfortunately for even the best adaptations, Persona is continually gutted of its most unique and standout ingredient, the life sim elements. In Persona 3, social links and other life simulation gameplay mechanics were added to the series, features that were not in previous titles. This drastically changed the way that the player interacted with the game and its characters. Instead of always progressing the main storyline, the player is expected to spend at least half of their total playtime getting to know supporting characters, raising their social stats, and studying for upcoming exams. This gameplay loop might sound mundane to some players, and sure, an arbitrary number of players will glance over the life simulation to get back to the RPG battles and the dramatic story. There's nothing inherently wrong with playing the game that way, because the story and main characters are strong enough to carry the weight, but it is undeniably underselling what makes Persona 3 so good. Likewise, the adaptations seem to forego this side of the game in favor of giving an abbreviated version of the main story. Unfortunately, the total removal of life simulation elements does not simply discard supporting characters or weightless subplots. It fundamentally disrupts the balance of Persona 3, a story that was specifically built around the duality of a life simulator and RPG. Persona 3 holistically pulls those two genres together in a way that gives value to its thematic focal point, the acceptance of mortality. Both the main and supporting characters have or will experience death throughout the story, and because of that, the beauty of Persona 3 is the simple moments in life. Going to the local burger joint with a friend, messaging a stranger in an MMO, or going to school events with your classmates, the trivial mundanities are what make life valuable despite the fact that life is fleeting. Hanging out with your classmate and listening to his stories of pursuing a teacher? Sure, it has nothing to do with the main story, but it has everything to do with the purpose of Persona 3. Not only that, a good portion of the supporting characters that the player meets through social links add a new perspective to consider. Sometimes it's a young author who is dying of cancer, and other times it's an elderly couple that lost their son. No matter what walks of life these characters have taken, no matter who they are, they have to simply make what they can out of the fragile life they are given. All of this is irrelevant in the adaptations. All of these characters are cameos at most, and the life simulation elements may as well not exist. Persona 3 is a story about death, but it uses the day-to-day life of the protagonist to contrast it, suggesting that life gives death meaning and vice versa. The lack of downtime and social links severely devalues the importance of living, considering half of the game is spent living daily life and making emotional connections with others. Removing this much about the protagonist's life inadvertently makes the theme of death significantly less powerful. It results in underselling its story, themes, and hell, my entire reason for loving Persona 3. Cutting this much fat is more like cutting into the meat itself. I understand that concessions must be made to effectively tell Persona 3's story in a different medium, and that a manga cannot give agency to the reader. As a game, Persona 3 allows the player to choose what they want to do and who they wish to develop bonds with. If the adaptation were to fully explore the social links, it would result in unavoidable sections that would be unappealing to some readers. Suddenly, the reader would be forced to experience life with characters they might not even like, and I'm not sure that would be the desired outcome that Persona 3 is going for. Although, even if that is the case, it begs the question of if a Persona 3 adaptation is simply doomed to never be as good as the game. Persona 4 The Animation did a decent job at including a few members of the supporting cast by simplifying their social links, so I won't say it's impossible, but even so, I don't believe the social links in that game are quite as vital when compared to Persona 3. The problem is, there is no way to entirely adapt Persona 3 without alienating some fans because the game is reliant on decision making, and I don't think an adaptation could ever completely capture that. Not to mention the difficulty of integrating social links in a linear medium like anime or manga without destroying the story's pacing. Gameplay-wise, the life simulation is balanced by the amount of time spent in battles, persona fusing, and dungeon crawling, things that inherently could not be brought over, and that might result in the opposite problem of what currently exists. In that sense, it isn't entirely the manga's fault that it's missing its spine. Still, that only makes me question the purpose of making such a half-finished adaptation. My previous criticism may have been harsh, but ultimately those problems are nearly unavoidable in the process of adapting Persona. What was avoidable was completely destroying any semblance of good story structure. Okay, let's dive into every bit of this manga and point out all the major structural issues that each volume has. I'm going to list off numerous problems and then we can discuss the larger general problem. Volume 1. Immediate problem. The first scene of the manga is the story pivotal moment where C seemingly defeats the final shadow on the Moonlight Bridge. This is a scene from nearing the end of the story and it has no meaning to someone who doesn't know the build-up. For the most part, it wouldn't be that horrible of an inclusion if not for the fact that the manga never fully tells the scene in one coherent piece. Worse yet is the immediate introduction of Ryoji, a character you really have no business knowing about until nearing the end. What point does it serve to introduce a character that has no direct story relevance until the climax? We're being introduced to Ryoji before all the story that should precede him. Because the manga opens this far into the story, it chooses to have some random girl give summaries for who the characters are, instead of simply introducing them naturally, despite the fact that their true introduction scenes suffice. What's frustrating is immediately after this phoned-in introduction, the next chapter is the opening scene from the game, which naturally introduces us to a handful of these characters. Volume 2. For most of Volume 2, things are looking mostly okay with Yukari's heart-to-heart with Minato and the introduction of Junpei. Then, out of nowhere, we suddenly jump to November 10th. Why is there another scene with Ryoji and Aigis? Even if it's just comedy, it serves no point other than to confuse. We don't even know who these characters are. Why are we spending time with them? Who are these guys? When do they come into the story? Is this girl a robot? Sure, in the game Ryoji and Aigis have mystery surrounding them, but these are not natural questions. These are questions only because they're appearing before their chronological story introductions. Volume 3. Okay, we're back in May, and maybe this time we can follow a coherent story order. Nope, we're back in November. Fuka is thanking Yukari for something we don't know, Aigis is here again without a proper introduction, Ken is here without an introduction, Mitsuru is clearly going through a tough time and we have no idea why, Yukari and Mitsuru's relationship is being concluded before it's hardly had a time to start, Ryoji is here again, and Ken is worried about Junpei and we don't understand why. That's a whole lot of information to give a reader who doesn't know anything about the story past May. Volume 4. The story suddenly jumps back 8 years to Mitsuru's backstory, a story reveal that isn't even in the main storyline of the game, before we know much of anything about her situation. Once again in November, she is reflecting on her past because something happened to her recently, but as far as we know, that hasn't happened yet. Alright, we're going back in time again. But it doesn't actually jump back to where we were, it skips one of the full moon shadows and then treats it as a flashback merely to show the light fan service, when it could have just shown the entire thing in the first place. Yukari questions if Mitsuru is hiding something, but because of the scene from 8 years ago, we already know that her and her father are not bad people, so all dramatic tension is kind of lost. The crew is about to go on vacation, the point in the story where Aigis is introduced. But do you want to know if Aigis' introduction is shown? Do you? No, it just uses this chance to show Yukari's drama and ignores Aigis, despite her presently appearing in places she shouldn't have. We jump forward to November, again, when all 12 full moon shadows have been defeated, even though we've only just been introduced to the concept. Nice group photo, I'm sure it has a lot of meaning. Too bad newcomers to Persona 3 will only know who half of them are. Showing Ikutsuki's heel turn this early doesn't allow for any build up, and Aigis being used as a weapon has no meaning when we still haven't even been introduced to her properly. This is artificially speeding up Yukari and Mitsuru's arcs while totally ignoring the overarching story and Aigis as a character. Now Yukari and Mitsuru have completed arcs, but for the sake of telling the full story, we have to go back in time before this. But wait, before we go back, we get nice fan service ahead of schedule. And what's that? Aigis' introduction? Nope, still don't have that. And who's that? Ryoji? Who would have guessed? Volume 5. Okay, we're just moving past explaining Aigis, and she's now unexplainably a part of the crew. Otherwise, nothing that crazy about this volume. Volume 6. Now that the story has truly reached November, this story that's had a fetish for continuously jumping ahead to November, you would expect that this manga would give it some real focus. But nope, all the ideas have already been shown in the most haphazard way, and when November could have been used as an emotional climax for multiple characters, it has nothing left to offer. Volume 7. Now it's December. Never mind, we're going back to July. After 6 previous volumes of having Aigis in and out of the story at random, she now gets her backstory told. The problem is, by moving it this far back, the importance of her progression as a character, a robot learning to understand the value of life, is totally gone. Continuing to December, never mind, back to November, because we have to explain what happened to Aigis 3 volumes ago. Back to December, for good this time. The remaining 4 volumes mostly stay on track from here on, partly because there's so little story to remain skipping around through. Admittedly, these last few volumes are pretty good overall. As a fan of the game, I can appreciate the climax being treated with respect. Unfortunately, the build-up to the climax is so disjointed that I can't imagine that many newcomers are going to be impressed by it. The biggest mishap is the handling of Mitsuru and Yukari's arcs. Showing a character finding their resolve to live, to continue fighting, to literally change their soul for the better, only for the story to shift back into lower gear and return to a time before their climactic resolution is so unbelievably jarring. It undercuts the emotional value of its characters and their personal journeys. I also have a personal grudge with how the manga pushes Aigis' backstory to the end of the story, the point in which her character is being concluded. Whether it's Aigis, Ryoji, Mitsuru, or Yukari, the manga is so misguided in how it structures their arcs. It often isolates their stories and key turning points from the rest of the characters in main story in what I assume is an attempt to give them focus. The problem is, Persona 3 cannot work like this. The story of Persona 3 was deliberately structured in an almost exclusively chronological order. Not only does this hide in the sense of daily life, the main characters are given fairly linear arcs that coincide with each other over a long period of time. There's so many moving parts, and the characters are supposed to be changing together. The entire point of the story following a calendar system is because it represents the passage of time and characters who gradually grow as the year moves forward. Jumping back and forth, only showing off the parts relevant to that particular character is so short-sighted. Even if the movie adaptations are not my favorite thing under the sun, at least they have the decency to tell the story in a coherent way for both fans and non-fans alike. Not only does this manga poorly tell the story events of Persona 3, it restructures it in a way that makes zero sense even in a vacuum. I can only imagine this is worse for someone that has no reference to the game. Keeping track of where we are in the story and what happens when is already hard enough for me, much less someone that doesn't have that pre-existing knowledge. This isn't how you tell a story, period. Even if the story wants to move around the timeline, being this erratic with it is sure to confuse any reader that isn't categorically organizing all the story beats chronologically in their memory. Regardless of my other criticisms of the manga, this is the worst, because if restructured in a better order, the manga would be significantly better overall. The individual scenes are plenty good, but it all goes to waste when they're ordered in a way that does not harmonize. What I would like to see in an adaptation of Persona 3 is an emphasis on the decisions that characters make, the long-term consequences of it, and their growth over the course of the entire story. What I don't want is for their story-spanning arcs to be conflated with segmented story arcs. I don't want their stories to be condensed down to a volume's worth of story or a couple episodes, much less it being out of order. While the arc-by-arc format generally works for Persona 4 the animation, it's in due part to how the original game structured its characters and story arcs from the beginning. And that structure is simply not the way that Persona 3 was made. With all due respect to the time and energy that was spent writing this manga, I don't believe the mangaka or whoever was primarily helming the writing knows how to structure or outline a story. Even in the author's note at the end of Volume 8, he claims that the next volume would likely be the final one. The manga then continued for another 3 volumes. If the mangaka doesn't even have it figured out enough to know whether he is 1 or 3 volumes away from the ending, that implies a severe lack of planning. Obviously, manga is released as it is made, and that means projections will fluctuate, but I'm a little baffled how he didn't realize the amount of story left would push beyond another 150 pages. As I hope I made it already clear by this point, Persona 3 is about living another day despite the unavoidable truth that we will all die one day. It is heavy, emotionally touching, and quite beautiful. I am a person who has thought about and struggled with the concept of death a lot. For me, Persona 3 is a humbling reminder that while death will come, life is still worth living. It makes the obvious statement, life does not have inherent meaning, you make your own meaning. Yet, despite the cliche idea, Persona 3 says it in the most earnest and heartfelt of ways. In the closing moments of Persona 3, the protagonist meets his end and dies so that his friends and loved ones can continue to live. He even pushes himself past the point that he should have died just to fulfill his promise to his friends. As his life comes to a close, the credits begin to play Memories of You, a song about losing someone important and cherishing the time you had with them. As I nearly started to cry, my mind was immediately filled with all the wonderful memories I made while playing the game with my girlfriend over the course of a year. The game and its ending connected with me in a way that very few pieces of media have been able to. I love this ending for as sad as it is, and I don't want it any different. The 4th movie adaptation actually did it fairly well, all things considered. I had no reason to assume the manga was going to be any different, and it almost isn't. The climax concludes in roughly the same way and continues as the game does. The protagonist is laying on Aiga's lap, and she's peacefully talking to him. His friends, remembering their promise, all run up to the roof to see their friend. When, all of a sudden, Minato stands up and says, "What's up, guys?" Why? I am all for optimistic stories and endings. If done right, a happy ending can be just as powerful as a sad ending. However, if a happy ending works against the message of its story, then why? Minato living at the end contradicts the entire point of Persona 3. It damn near ruins its core narrative themes that even the manga adaptation worked up to. I don't know if the mangaka just didn't understand what happened at the end of the game, or if this is just meant to be a happy version. Either way, I'm not happy. Remember what I said about how life gives meaning to death and death gives meaning to life? Well, the manga doesn't just sell the meaning of life short, it sells the meaning of death short as well. The protagonist's self-sacrifice means nothing if there is no sacrifice. I can get behind positive messages, but this is not a message. It is the destruction of a message. While this is not as prevalent of a problem as the story structure, it's still worth noting how much this spits in the face of Persona 3. This is easily my least favorite thing about Persona 3's manga adaptation. Here's the thing, I want to like the Persona 3 manga, I even bought the entire series physically. That does not mean I can bring myself to like it, but I feel that way because there are things of value in this adaptation. Not to mention, as a pre-existing fan, yeah, I want any version of Persona 3 to be good. When I read it, I didn't even have a bad time for the most part. I was excited to see certain parts of Persona 3 in manga form, where the art could detail scenes that admittedly look a little goofy with low polygon models. Luckily, Tsuji Sogabe has really solid character art, and he simplified the now iconic designs by Shigenori Sojima to a reasonable degree. Overall, the characters look great, and the art elevates some of Persona 3's best moments. Many of the scenes are well put together, and I often don't have a problem with the moment-to-moment storytelling either. I can imagine a world where this manga is able to tell the story effectively and perhaps capture an audience beyond pre-existing fans. While I wish it had better story structure and didn't squander the ending as I've discussed throughout this video, the individual parts of the story are adequate. The comedy isn't my exact cup of tea. I generally prefer the game's comedy, but I have to admit that this isn't a bad interpretation of the game's sense of humor. It manages to showcase the characters' quirky personalities and how they bounce off of each other in a way that's fairly faithful with a slightly different flavor from the game. I can't complain here. Shuichi Sogabe also seemed truly excited to make it. In the author's note, he mentioned being a fan of the game, enough to play it multiple times and pre-order Persona 4 when it was about to release. Atlus didn't get just anyone to make the manga adaptation, they got someone who understood and cared about the source material. He also mentions the pressure of trying to complete this story in a timely manner, not to mention that this was his first published work. For as much as I struggle to like this manga adaptation, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt. After all, the Persona 3 manga became better in the second half, which somewhat lines up with a 2.5-year break during the time he worked on the Persona 4 manga. I can't speak on the Persona 4 manga, I haven't read it yet, but perhaps it's better than this adaptation. Maybe I'll find out one day. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you want to follow me on my socials or check out my art, like the animation on screen, links are in the description. Until next time.